This video lecture will cover. So in the last video lecture on liberalism, we looked at classical liberalism and social liberalism. And in this video lecture, we're going to focus on neoliberalism and inclusive liberalism and a few variations thereon. Then there'll be a separate video lecture about post-liberalism, which is really kind of taking the material to the next step. There's no reading on post-liberalism, but I thought it would be an interesting idea to introduce to you, as you'll see some echoes of it in the contemporary political landscape and certainly in the policy landscape. Before I get into the in-depth material about the forms of liberalism, I would just like to mention the fact that we're touching on some examples that relate to gender relations and liberalism and the way in which gender is taken up within the context of liberalism. And I think it's important to remember that within a classical liberal model, there is an assumption of the male head of household, a male breadwinner model. So here we have this belief that a family can and should be able to operate on a single income, that the male partner in a heteronormative nuclear family is the person who goes out and earns money in the community. He sells his labor in the open free market to gain wages for the family, whereas the female family member stays at home and engages in labor within the context of the private and is responsible for the well-being of family members and the rearing of children. So even though we have this as a historical kind of model, it certainly echoes and has a hangover in contemporary policy development and in contemporary society. But what makes it a bit challenging is that in our contemporary economic reality, most families require two incomes, or maybe even people having multiple jobs, in order to be able to live. And so this idea that you can have one person outside in the community and one person at home engaging in household domestic labor, and that definition takes place on the basis of gender and gender roles, is really challenging for our contemporary reality. So I just wanted to make note of that and kind of invite people to think about what that means and what kinds of pressure that places on families and society, and who gets excluded from these kinds of understandings when this is the model for making policy. Liberal humanism is very much foundational in Canadian social policy and really in global social policy from about the post-war era. Here we see this idea that the market and the family still plays a central role in providing resources for people, caring for members of their family, providing income and guidance, but we also see the state start to play a role. Capitalism is still seen as a very beneficial and good part of our social fabric, but there is an acknowledgement by the state that there are winners and losers in capitalism, and that because some people suffer as a result of this economic system, the state does have a role to play in mitigating some of those possible harms. Bob Mullally provides us with a great definition of liberal humanism in his 2009 textbook. He describes this idea that by virtue of being human, all people are understood to have value. So we see that the human species has a kind of supremacy, and that if you're a member of the human species, then you are entitled to particular resources and supports because you have value. So because you are human and you have value, by virtue of having value, you have the right to actualize your full potential. If you are an important part of the food chain, so to speak, then you ought to be able to actualize your full potential, be all that you can be. It benefits you and it benefits others. And by virtue of being human and having value and being able to actualize your full potential, you ought to have the capacity to understand your full potential and the good life in your own way, which is very much tied to that traditional classical liberalism. Again, because capitalism fails to provide the resources necessary for daily living and for the actualization of full potential, the state does have a role to play in mitigating this problem and providing solutions to human beings. So we might then say that humans have a right to the resources necessary to support their obtainment of what they understand as the good life, and the state plays a role in that. We might want to ask some questions about, what exactly sufficient resources are and how the state understands that, and what constitutes full potential and what constitutes the good life. But there is this understanding that interfering and developing policy beyond maintaining access to the free market and access to independent understandings of self and the good life is a tolerable and acceptable and, in fact, necessary thing. John Maynard Keynes was the father of Keynesianism, and this theory looks at the process by which governments may infuse resources into the economy when the economy begins to retract in order to stimulate economic growth, keep people working, and collect the taxes that they would normally pay, thus creating a kind of equilibrium. During times of economic growth and good times, governments are encouraged to save in order to ensure that they have resources in reserve and not too much deficit, so that when the economy eventually retracts again, they can respond. There's a great little video that's included on A2L for you to watch about Keynesianism. Those folks can do a far better job than I can in explaining this theory. And now we're coming to neoliberalism. Students often joke that you can't possibly leave the MAC program without knowing a lot about neoliberalism. But neoliberalism, if we look at it from sort of a bird's eye view, really harkens back to a lot of the traditions of classical liberalism. They are concerned with more market, so getting things into the free market, and having less government and less government intervention. So whatever the market can do, the market can do. The role of the state is not to provide services or to be a nanny, but rather to govern so that people can have better access to the free market and the economy can do what it's supposed to do. Neoliberalism really challenges Keynesian models, and so the idea of infusing cash and responding to some kind of an economic crisis or downturn is not seen as a good use of government and tax resources. It is better instead to allow the market to remain unfettered and uninterrupted. Neoliberalism comes with a set of tools that allow governments to actualize this process of minimizing the state and maximizing return to the free market. So neoliberalism wants the privatization of everything and anything that could possibly be privatized. Once upon a time, Petro-Canada used to be known as British Petroleum, and it was a government-owned and operated gas company that provided fuel oil and gasoline to the public at large. We had other options as well, but there was a state-owned and state-run petroleum company. It eventually became a crown corporation, which adheres more closely to kind of a public-private partnership model. But now we want privatization exclusively. We really want government to get out of the business of petroleum or telephones or hospitals or education or just about anything that you can think of. Services are also contracted out. If you can't actually eliminate your involvement in a service, then you can subcontract it to another company. In Hamilton, we have contracted out recycling services. In Toronto, some areas of the city have contracted out garbage pickup. We have contracted out cleaning in universities and contracted out cafeteria services in universities and hospitals. All of these used to be state-run or government jobs that paid a good wage and were generally unionized. along with contracting out comes lower wages and usually a lack of unionization. Public-private partnerships are something that we're going to talk a lot more about later on in the course, but here we see government and private enterprise engaging in the development of resources and services, with the private company maintaining most of the economic risk that's associated with those partnerships. We are returning to the notion of the deserving and undeserving poor and the process of disciplining those who are understood as marginalized or dispossessed. You need to come on board with the expectation of work and the expectation of looking for work if you're someone who's experiencing unemployment or poverty. There's also a return to the idea of the male breadwinner model, and there are resources and supports and policies that are put in place to motivate people to return to that model. The privatization of family caregiving is something that is encouraged, because when you care for people at home for free, it doesn't register on the GDP. But when you provide care to them in institutional settings or informal settings, like childcare centers or homes for the aged, then we certainly can register this as part of GDP. So we're returning or introducing family caregiving into the private market. So there's a real normalization and moral superiority associated with labor participation and working. So similar again to the time of the Poor Law. And as I've said, we are maximizing the notion of the deserving and undeserving poor as a basis on which we deliver services. Just like we've seen some softening of other forms of liberalism, we see a softening of neoliberalism with the introduction of inclusive liberalism. It's a bit like liberal humanism, but maybe a tiny bit more complicated. Like liberal humanism, inclusive liberalism acknowledges that there may be some complication with the idea that the market can respond to everyone and all needs. While individuals are still understood to need to support themselves through the market, and that the bulk of their needs should be met within the free market, there is an acknowledgement that there might be a need to respond to certain groups of individuals because they have experienced some kind of harm or inequity within the system. There may be a need to engage in some kind of social or political change that may require the state to intervene to support individuals and the market to respond to that need. So for example, if we look at some of the Canadian policies around investment in green energy technology, we see that the government has supported individuals through, say, energy efficiency tax credits if you renovate your home or if you have solar panels installed. And the market has also been supported through investment in green energy companies in order to respond to the effects of global warming. It's unlikely, given the value of petroleum products and other carbon-emitting fuels, that there would be a rapid turnaround to move from those traditional sources of energy to green energies. But we know that it's necessary to do so because global warming is dramatically affecting us. If you live in California at the present time, you would certainly be concerned about what's happening. And many people across Canada are also experiencing the effects of global warming. So it is something that we have to be concerned with, and it is something that government has identified as necessary and requiring some kind of intervention, both monetary and policy-wise. Like standard neoliberalism, inclusive liberalism also has a bit of a toolkit. So it wants to ensure that we maintain growth in our economy, but that the growth that we produce does not produce inflation. Inflation is harmful for the market overall, although it might mean a few people make a bit more money. Inclusive liberalism introduces something called labor market flexibility. It might be better to describe labor market flexibility as employee flexibility, because it requires employees to be more flexible in their work habits and in their expectation from their employers. So the pandemic has certainly shown how workers are expected to be flexible. Many of you may be working from home. Many of you may be working in different ways than you did before. You may be wearing PPE at work. In some cases, you may be expected to provide your own PPE for work. You certainly might be supplementing your employer's work through the use of your own hydroelectric, your own space at home, and other supplies and materials that you don't get reimbursed for. So these are some of the examples of what's described as labor market flexibility, when oftentimes it is, in fact, as I said, employee flexibility. There is a normalization of employment. So people are meant to be at work. If you're not at work, you should be working towards going to work through training or other kinds of programs that will help you get back to work. And sometimes those incentives or those opportunities are actually provided to employers. So there are many programs that provide employers with wage subsidies so that they can hire more workers or keep the workers that they have. And we've seen some of those techniques employed during the mass unemployment resulting from COVID-19. The notion of empowerment is used within discourses of inclusive liberalism to describe how people are motivated to embrace the market and participate in the market. If you're under the age of 30, you might have looked at some of the entrepreneurship loans and grants that the federal government has. If you haven't, you might want to take a look at them. These provide individual people under the age of 30, as I said, with some financial resources, some capital, to create a new job for themselves or a new product that they can sell. And so there is a real emphasis on participating in the market, either through formal employment or through entrepreneurial activities. There are a number of perspectives referred to as strategies for coping with globalization that are introduced. And so we see governments attend to things like trade subsidies and trade agreements that support the movement of goods around the country. Sometimes we're negotiating one commodity in exchange for another. We want to sell our wine in Europe, so we will take European cheese, even though we make a lot of cheese in Canada. And so we make these agreements in order to support globalization. Some of the strategies for globalization that are employed with individuals are things like the notion of labor market flexibility. So there is a sense that people will need to be retrained and can expect to be unemployed and reemployed during their work life. They may also engage in what is sometimes referred to as the gig economy, which I think sometimes should be referred to as the kick economy, which means basically that people work at short-term contracts or day work instead of having a stable singular job. To be honest, when I graduated from my MSW, I was unable to get any permanent work. And so for almost 15 years, I worked from one contract to another. I was really happy that we had a parental and paternity leave program in Canada because I worked a lot of maternity leave contracts. Anyway, the other thing that inclusive liberalism does is engages in some moral education by transferring these values to coming generations. You might have heard things like lifelong learning or, celebrate the fact that you'll have multiple careers in your lifetime. Well, these ideas normalize the fact that people will experience periods of unemployment and reemployment, and these things may require us to engage in training or retraining or upgrading of skills in order to be able to access the labor market. So this is the meaning of inclusive liberalism, a subset of neoliberalism that reflects some values of liberal humanism, but not all. There has been resistance to inclusive liberalism and neoliberalism. You might have noted things on the television discussing Uber and resistance to Uber or to organizations like Airbnb or to employment through the gig economy with employers like Skip the Dishes. Individuals and groups of people who work for or work with these organizations have begun court challenges and other forms of resistance to challenge the way in which these modes of providing services and resources in the community affect individuals and affect the community at large. Uber has been critiqued, first of all, for treating their drivers badly, for lacking protections for people who take rides from them, and for failing to screen drivers who engage in criminal behavior such as sexual assault or other forms of violence. Airbnb has dramatically shifted the rental market in large cities like Toronto, where people may prefer to have short-term tenants prepared to pay large sums of money for the use of a condo or apartment, versus having a long-term tenant who would expect a fee for the rental that is more consistent with the wage levels in the town or city. Skip the Dishes and other food delivery organizations that hire couriers to do piecework or to work on contract have also been challenged. Employees working in these settings have suggested that they aren't contractors, they are in fact employees, and therefore they should have the wages and benefits associated with that kind of employment. As Amit said, we've seen some of the places where there are limits to change, and we've also seen some of the limits created through change. In some circumstances, when governments put in place limits on organizations like Uber or Airbnb, they leave. They don't elect to stay and continue their business in that jurisdiction. Skip the Dishes maybe remains to be seen what happens with that. But it is an option for an employer who engages in these kinds of neoliberal work traditions to just elect not to work in that area. And while we might say, well, some people lose their jobs, they lose their jobs as Uber drivers, they lose their jobs driving and delivering food. But we still need rides, and we still need food delivered, and we've done it other ways in the past and can probably create some new and better ways to do it in the future. So sometimes these challenges render good things. They might be disruptive in the short term, but beneficial in the long term. Bignell, another scholar in this area, suggests that change requires us to know about how we make meaning and how changing the meaning can create a kind of instability. And instability can lead to forms of change that are beneficial. So if we look at something like employment insurance, which has, over the last 20 years, experienced a number of policy shifts that have made it more difficult for individuals to access this social welfare program, we know that COVID-19 and mass unemployment and a demonstration of large numbers of people who would have been ineligible to receive EI if that had been the only employment-related income support program. This has led to the federal government making some decisions about amending EI, employment insurance. And so it'll be interesting to see what gets announced on Wednesday, the day of class, in regard to the throne speech and how employment insurance may become more inclusive as a result of COVID-19. Identity politics is also important in this because we now are often concerned with affiliating ourselves with other people who we see as similar or alike and who might experience the same kinds of challenges or complications that we have experienced in the past. Identity politics has always been part of change making, but we have a broader definition of identity than we ever have before. And so the ways in which people make relationships and build coalitions can produce some interesting interconnections and relationships, and can, as a result, produce interesting and innovative change. I hope this lecture has been helpful. We're going to talk a little bit about post-liberalism in the next one. It should be pretty short, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all in class. Well, not in class, but on the computer during our Zoom meeting next Wednesday.